and had no means of escape. And yet, the plague also could not be completely bought off. It reached into the palaces and monasteries too. Priests and monks and nuns died in enormous numbers, partly because their duty required them to tend to the sick and administer last rites to the dying. It is estimated that in some parts of France, more than half of all clergy died during the outbreak. This created a crisis not just of mortality, but of faith. The Church, the institution that was supposed to have answers, the institution that promised God's protection to the righteous, could not protect its own servants. How could it protect anyone else? And when a priest himself lay dying of the plague, who would give him his last rites? Who would comfort him? These were questions that cut to the very core of medieval European society, and they did not have easy answers. Among the Jewish population of Paris, and of Europe more broadly, the plague brought additional horror of a different kind. As the deaths mounted and the fear deepened, people began to look for someone to blame. In many parts of Europe, though the evidence for Paris specifically is mixed, Jewish communities were accused of causing the plague by poisoning wells. This was a lie, a vile and desperate lie born of ignorance and fear. But it led to massacres and pogroms in many places across France and Germany and beyond. The Jewish people of Europe, already marginalized and persecuted, became scapegoats for a catastrophe that no human hand had caused. Pope Clement VIII, who, to his credit, issued papal bulls condemning these attacks and declaring that Jewish people were dying of the plague, just as Christians were, could not stop the violence everywhere. The darkness of the plague years was not only the darkness of disease, it was also the darkness of what human beings can do to one another when they are frightened and looking for someone to blame. Let us return to the streets of Paris, because there is something almost unbearably powerful about imagining this city that we know today as one of the most beautiful in the world, with its cafes and boulevards and museums, as a place of such profound, overwhelming suffering. Picture the Rue Saint-Denis, one of the main arteries of the city, normally crowded with pilgrims and traders. Now half empty, the shutters of many houses closed, a cart moving slowly down the center of the street loaded with bodies, a man walking ahead ringing a small bell, calling out for people to bring out their dead. Picture the sign in the gray morning light, and on its banks, a group of survivors who have wrapped cloth around their faces, dragging the body of someone they once knew, a neighbor, perhaps, or a former friend, down to the water's edge, because the graveyards are full and they have nowhere else to put him. Picture the Cathedral of Notre Dame, where masses are being held continuously, day and night, the prayers of the terrified rising up through the incense smoke toward the great rose window, toward God, toward anything that might hear them and help. And then, something extraordinary happened. The plague began to recede, not because anyone had found a cure, not because the prayers had worked, not because the stars had shifted, but because plagues by their nature eventually run out of victims, or the conditions that sustain them change, or some combination of factors we still don't fully understand tips the balance back toward survival. By 1349, the worst was beginning to pass in Paris, but the city that emerged from the plague was not the city that had gone into it. The numbers are staggering and almost impossible to fully absorb. Historians estimate that between 1348 and 1349, Paris lost somewhere between a third and a half of its entire population. In a city of 200,000, that means somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 people died in the span of roughly 2 years. Think about what that means in practical terms: streets where every other house had lost someone, or had lost everyone. Families reduced from 6 members to 2. Entire neighborhoods where the silence was the first thing you noticed, where there were houses standing open with no one inside, where the dogs wandered without owners, where children played alone in empty streets that had once been full of life. The survivors were mocked by what they had witnessed in ways that are not easy to describe, but that you can feel in the art and literature that emerged from this period. A strange, dark fascination with death entered the cultural imagination of medieval Europe. The dance macabre, the dance of death, became a popular artistic motif, depicting skeletons leading all manner of people, from kings to peasants, in a final dance. It was a reminder, graphic and even darkly humorous, that death is the great equalizer, that no matter who you are, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, beautiful or plain, the dance eventually comes for everyone. This imagery appeared on church walls, in illuminated manuscripts, in poetry. It was the art of people who had looked into the abyss and come back changed. But here is what is also true, and it is important to say this, because the story of the Black Death is not only a story of suffering, it is also, in its strange and painful way, a story of transformation. The plague broke things open. The tremendous loss of life created a labor shortage across Europe that slowly, over the following decades, began to shift power away from the feudal lords and toward ordinary working people, who suddenly found that their labor was in demand, that they could negotiate, that they had options they had never had before. The authority of the church was weakened, not destroyed, but weakened by its inability to explain or stop the plague. And this cracking of unquestioned religious authority was one of the early tremors that would eventually, over the next century and more, contribute to the conditions that made the Renaissance and then the Reformation possible. History does not move in straight lines, and the Black Death was not the cause of all the changes that followed it, but it was a catastrophic rupture in the fabric of medieval European society, and nothing was exactly the same afterward. The people of Paris in 1348 did not know any of this. They did not know they were living through a hinge point in history. They only knew that they were afraid, that they were grieving, that people they loved were dying in terrible ways, and that no one, not the king, not the bishop, not the most learned physician, could tell them why or make it stop. They only knew the weight of loss, the confusion of survival, the strange guilt of still being alive, when so many others were not, and yet they endured. The city did not empty. The church bells still rang. The University of Paris eventually reopened its doors. The markets slowly filled again. Children were born to replace the dead, because life, insistent and stubborn and beautiful, does what it has always done. It continues. It finds a way. The Paris that came out the other side of the Black Death was quieter, smaller, and scarred in ways both visible and invisible. But it was still Paris. It was still remarkably alive. We should remember them, the nuns of the Hotel-Dieu who stayed at their posts and died at their work, the gravediggers who went out every morning into the stench and the grief, the mothers who held their children anyway, knowing the risk, the physicians who tried their ridiculous and useless remedies, because trying felt better than doing nothing, the priests who gave last rites to the last person, who could still give them, the ordinary men and women of Paris, who simply got up every day and tried to keep going. They could not save themselves with knowledge. They did not have the knowledge. They could not protect themselves with technology. They did not have the technology. All they had was each other, and even that was dangerous. And still they survived. Still the city survived. The Black Death of 1348 was one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. In Paris, as in so many other places, it left a wound that took generations to fully heal, if it ever fully healed at all. But standing on the banks of the Seine today, watching the city hum and breathe and move in its tireless, magnificent way, it is impossible not to feel something for those who came before, for the 200,000 people who were here in 1347, who walked these same streets, who looked up at the same sky, who loved and quarreled and prayed and hoped and died and, in dying, made space for everything that came after. They are gone. But the city they loved and feared and suffered in is still here, still standing, still, after all this time, alive.